Hello everybody, welcome to the Soane Museum Study Group. This session is going to be an in-conversation format between myself and two highly esteemed scholars who I'm very pleased to have join us today. We have David Hemsoll of Birmingham University and Paul Davies of Reading University, both of whom are world-renowned architectural historians among a plethora of work that they have undertaken, both individually and together. They've done a lot of work on the Cassiano del Pozzo drawings collection at the Royal Collection, and as a result, they were perfectly placed to come to the Soane Museum and catalogue, or start an immense project to catalogue our fabulous Codex Coner volume. So we're going to be talking about the Codex Coner volume today, some of Paul and David's discoveries and what they're up to. So thank you, Paul and David. And let's kick off. First, can I ask you to tell me, what is the Codex Coner?
Well, thank you very much, Francis. The Codex Coner is this wonderful book of early 16th century drawings, which document Rome's ancient monuments at that early part of the 16th century. The book, or the drawings rather, were produced actually during the lifetime of the very famous High Renaissance architect Bramante, which we need to see the slide of, please, Paul. Two of whose buildings you can see here. So on the left, there is the Tempietto, which is drawn in the Codex Coner. And on the right, there is the Church of St. Peter's, of course, as it exists today, which was built on the basis of Bramante's original designs. And two of these designs, or two designs relating to Bramante's St. Peter's, also feature in the Codex Coner. Next slide, I think, please, Paul. The thing about the Codex Coner is it is a remarkable artifact. And in fact, it's one of the most prized possessions of the Soane Museum. I've been told by Bruce Boucher, the director of the Soane Museum, that it, as a sort of wonder, it ranks only behind the sarcophagus of Seti I. So you can begin to see the kind of esteem in which it is held. I think we can move forward a bit more. Next question, Fran.
Yes. So how did this extraordinarily important volume actually come to the Soane Museum?
Well, we know very little about the early history of the book after its manufacture. And the first records of it date from the 17th century, when we know it was acquired by Cassiano del Pozzo as part of his celebrated paper museum. As we'll see, he transformed the Codex into an album, as we'll be looking at that a little bit later on. From that point on, it passed through various generations of his family. He himself had no offspring, but his brother did, and it passed to Cosimo Antonio, who sold it to Pope Clement XI. And it passed from Pope Clement XI to the Albani family, and it was acquired from the Albani family by George III in 1762. The agent acting on George's behalf was James Adam. And from the Adam family, it was acquired by Sir John Soane, and that is how it ends up in the Soane Museum. And we see in the image on the screen. On the left, there's the palace of Cassiano dal Pozzo in Rome near Sant'Andrea della Valle, and of course on the right, we know that the volume came from this collection, the collection of Cassiano dal Pozzo, partly because of the characteristics of the volume itself, the binding, which is a 17th century binding, and at the spine there's a handwriting that is typical of Cassiano's collection, but more particularly because of the seal that appears at the bottom of one of the pages, which was applied to all the Cassiano volumes by Anna Teresa Benzoni, the wife of and this, in short, is the history, the provenance of the book.
It's extremely pleasing for me as an Adam scholar to think that this important item is tangentially connected to my own area of study, albeit it is rather sad that the Adam collection came to Soane as a result of the Adam family's financial difficulties and their sales at Christmas in the early 19th century. So why is the Codex Coner so very well known and famous?
Well, there are various parts of an answer to this question. So, first of all, it is to do with its early date. So, if we look at all the compilations of drawings of antiquities that were made in the Renaissance period, this comes very near the very start. We can be a bit more precise about the date compared with previous scholars. Previous scholars thought that the book dated from soon after Bramante's death in 1514, partly because there are so many Bramante buildings drawn on the pages. But our research strongly suggests that the book was produced just before Bramante's death in 1514. So the production of the book wouldn't be associated with the death of Bramante. Instead, it is much more likely that it came about because of the accession to the papal throne of Pope Leo X in 1513, when new opportunities arose, new interests arose, and what we strongly feel is that the production of the Codex Coner ties in to these new opportunities and interests. So that's part of why the book is so famous. Another reason that it's so famous is entirely to do with the number and the quality of the drawings which the compilation contains. So it deals very extensively with ancient architecture in Rome and also with some recent buildings in Rome. And the drawings are, well, I would say they are very beautiful in many ways. So they're meticulously executed and very clearly executed. And it seems, moreover, that the book was regarded as being of such merit that several of these Codex Coner drawings were actually copied by Michelangelo very early on in his career. People think, probably correctly, that this copying phase in Michelangelo's drawing career was to do with him gaining familiarity with classical ancient architecture, and we can imagine him doing that by way of copying the drawings in the Codex Coner. So he went to this particular book in order to improve his expertise in architecture. And then there's a final reason why the book is so famous, and that's because it was catalogued very early on, as long ago as 1904, so that it entered the art historical literature at a very key moment. And this has meant that lots and lots of architectural historians have got to know about the Codex Coner and its drawings, which are all meticulously reproduced. And they've got to know about all this material through this remarkable publication, which is, even now, is the way in which you get to find out about the compilation. Yes, so.
That 1904 catalogue was by a gentleman named Ashby.
Thank you.
Can you tell us a little bit about Ashby and some more about his fabulous catalogue?
Well, Ashby was a very notable person in his time. He was what we would call an archaeologist, except he would probably call himself a classical topographer, which meant he was really interested in the identification and the location of ancient buildings in the ancient city of Rome. And he was based for much of his scholarly life in Rome, and he eventually became the director of the British School of Rome. And this is why his catalogue is published in the papers of the British School of Rome, in fact, in the second volume. And his catalogue fills the entirety of this second volume. So it is, in a sense, an entire book on the Codex Coner, all the drawings catalogued, all the drawings then reproduced. The catalogue itself was his major scholarly work, and the British School at Rome has still got the photographic plates of all the sheets of drawings which were made in connection with the publication of the work. We're looking here on the screen at two typical pages of the catalogue. And what Ashby was preoccupied with was identifying the drawings, which is often not all that easy. But he managed impressively to get nearly everything absolutely right. And not only did he do that, that is, identify what the drawings were of, sometimes just fragments of buildings, but he also went a long way towards gathering together other Renaissance drawings of the same subjects. So through this sort of collective lens of early 16th century perception and scholarship, you can begin to see or find out a great deal about how the early 16th century regarded Rome's ancient heritage.
So following this magnificent effort on Ashby's part and his publication of the catalogue, was there really any further work that needed doing?
As scholars inevitably want to imagine, well, yes, there is. So we can, first of all, distinguish what Ashby did and what we might want to do today. So Ashby was focused in his interests in what the drawings could tell us about classical antiquity, but he was much less interested in the broader subject of Renaissance antiquarianism and the history of architectural drawings. In other words, he wasn't really interested in how ideas about buildings evolved over time. So we can see a drawing in the Codex Coner as it were, being modified at a subsequent moment and then remodified again as understanding of a particular building becomes ever greater. Ashby wasn't interested in that at all. All he was interested in was saying, this is a drawing of a certain building, and there are other drawings of that same building. So as a result, what you find in the catalogue is sometimes when the identification is rather tricky, he writes quite a lot, but sometimes when the identification is, as it were, obvious, such as a drawing of the Colosseum, he just says, this is a drawing of the Colosseum, and you don't really go any further beyond that. So he, what he did was produce a great body of information in which he was right about many things, although he wasn't correct about absolutely everything. And there are some conspicuous things that he was wrong about. So, for example, if we look at the next, that's right, if we look at the next slide, he was of the opinion that the Codex Coner was executed, the drawings were executed by an individual called Andreas Konair, which is the name that appears in the 17th century writing on the spine. So there was a long tradition before Ashby where people thought the Codex Coner was executed by Andreas Konair, about whom people know actually very little, apart from the fact it turns out that Konair was a prominent scholar, humanist of German origin, but active in early 16th century Rome. But it's quite clear in the end that this scholar wasn't responsible for the drawings, and the authorship wasn't sorted out for decades and decades. It was only resolved in the 1970s by a German scholar called Tilman Budensieg, who happened to find a drawing in the Uffizi, which was one of the ones that Ashby remarkably didn't identify, a drawing of the temple of Castor and Pollux. He found one in the Uffizi, which was virtually identical to one in the Codex Coner, and moreover, it had written on it the name of the draftsman, who was Bernardo della Volpaia. And this hypothesis of Budensieg has been judged to be absolutely correct, and Bernardo della Volpaia has been regarded ever since Budensieg's time as the draftsman of the Codex Coner.
Perhaps we ought to rename it the Della Volpaia Conair. No, perhaps not. But it's
no, it hasn't got the same charm.
No.
Who was the Codex Coner originally actually made for?
Well, oh, sorry, Paul.
That's all right. It's quite an interesting question, actually, because normally with books of drawings by architects, the general assumption is that they were made for personal consumption, that they were made as either a model book or a sketchbook that enabled the architect to gather information about antiquity that could then be used for designing future projects. But there's much internal evidence in this particular book to suggest that it really wasn't made for Bernardo himself, Bernardo della Volpaia that is, but for an antiquarian. Now, one of the reasons to suppose that is that much of the text applied to the drawings, the annotations, are written in Latin rather than Italian. And so the whole character of the book has this sort of very antiquarian feel about it. But we also know that it wasn't produced like a sketchbook. In other words, acquiring drawings over a long period of time, as we'll see a little bit later on. It was produced very, very quickly, perhaps in a matter of a year or so, which suggests that it was made for somebody else rather than by an architect for himself. So who could this antiquarian be? Well, there's a clue in one of the drawings in the sketchbook. Attached to a drawing of a sundial is a letter actually signed by Andreas Konair. This is why Cassiano seemed to think that the book was produced by Andreas Konair. But what's interesting about this letter is that it's addressed to Bernardo Rucellai. And we see just up here, Bernardo's name. Now, Bernardo Rucellai has quite an interesting pedigree in terms of knowing about architecture. His father, Giovanni Rucellai, was one of the great patrons of architecture in 15th century Florence, having built Palazzo Rucellai, the facade of Santa Maria Novella. And so Bernardo would have grown up knowing about architecture or being involved with architecture in some way. And we know that there's some evidence that he even made drawings himself. He was the brother-in-law of Lorenzo de' Medici, the Magnificent. And for Lorenzo, to Lorenzo rather, I should say, he sent a drawing of his own with suggestions about how he might modify a villa in the Florentine countryside. So here's somebody who is an intellectual, interested in architecture, and the evidence that he's interested in antiquity particularly is to be found in the fact that he visited ancient monuments in 1471 in the company of the great architect Leon Battista Alberti, and that he himself wrote a tract on the ancient architecture of Rome called De Urbe Roma, which remained in manuscript form until the 18th century, but had been written actually in 1502 or thereabouts. So although we can't prove that Bernardo Rucellai was the patron of the book, lots of circumstantial evidence seems to point in that direction.
So if Bernardo is potentially or probably the patron, can you tell me why is the Codex in a 17th century binding?
Well, what seems to have happened is that the original Codex was reformatted in the early 17th century by Cassiano del Pozzo. So he acquired the Codex and dismantled it, and then mounted the sheets into sort of windowed mounts to form an album, probably in the 1630s, rather than later than that, because of the comparison with other volumes in his collection suggests that the mounting technique dates from that period. When we know a little bit about the history of the Codex when it made its, or just after it made its way into Cassiano del Pozzo's hands. We know that Cassiano del Pozzo originally had no intention of transforming it into an album. Rather, what he did was have members of the team of artists that he employed to make drawings for his paper museum to insert additional drawings into some of the blank pages. So we have a book, some pages are blank, so Cassiano thinks, well, we'll just put some more drawings in it. And then I suppose you can ask, well, why did he then go on to dismantle it? Well, I think the answer to that is primarily to monumentalize it. The book itself originally was quite a small book, but Cassiano was acquiring drawings, aggrandizing them by mounting them into fantastic albums. And so he thought, there are lots of blank pages in this book. Why don't I just take it all apart and turn it into something utterly beautiful, which is what he did. Okay.
So can you say a little bit, or do you know anything about what the Codex Coner looked like before it was recast into this aggrandized album?
Well, I think we can get a long way in reconstructing the original appearance of the book. First of all, we know it was a relatively small book, a sort of quarto-sized book. And it was almost certainly originally not, strictly speaking, a codex. It was probably two codices.
I think the next slide will help you, Paul.
Will it? Thank you very much. Oops, gone too far. Yes. We know this because of the numbering that appears on the folios. There are two sequences of numbers, one that begins at 1 and goes through to 99 verso, and another that begins at 6 and goes to 34. So we know that there were two books. And that was something actually that Ashby recognized and suggested himself. We also know that there are many folios that are now missing, and the numbering tells us that. There are 20 folios from the first of the codices and 12, at least 12 from the second. Now, these missing pages were probably blank or damaged. The reason that some of them may have been damaged is that there's evidence that certain of the sheets were originally laid down, in other words, glued onto a mount sheet. And then at that point, Cassiano decided to change his mind, took them off the mount sheet, and so you have this page with scraps of paper attached to the back of it. So that's one reason to suppose that some of the pages may be lost or damaged for that reason. Another of the reasons is that some of the 17th century drawings that Cassiano inserted into the codices have 17th century drawings on both sides of the folio. So there were blank pages in the book or books, now suggesting that when it was bound, there were several such blank pages. And it's likely that when Cassiano took the two codices apart, he discarded the blank pages, retaining all the drawings, the 16th century drawings and the 17th century drawings that he had made, and then mounted them in an album. We can get some way to even working out how the gatherings of the book were bound together. We can do this by using a light sheet to reveal the structure of the paper. And then by matching up the chain lines, the horizontal chain lines in the paper, and watermarks that have been cut through, we can work out pretty well how the whole book worked. I'm not going to go into more detail at this point, but it does provide some sort of insight onto what some of the original sheets looked like.
Can I just add something?
Of course you can, David. Yes.
Just to explain what we're looking at here. This is these are two pieces of paper seen through with backlighting, and the point is that the chain lines, which are the horizontal lines in the handmade paper of one sheet, then match with another sheet, which means originally the two sheets belonged to the same piece of paper which was folded. So this is what this illustration is showing you, how two different pages in the Codex have got matching chain lines and were therefore originally united in a bound sketchbook.
Absolutely fascinating for me. I'm so familiar with the volume to actually see the way you've put those two images together and see the way the chain lines really do run together, as do the watermarks. So can you tell us a little bit more about how it was made?
Yes, we using many of these same techniques, we've managed to work out that it was produced in almost certainly in a very short period of time. And this is suggested by the fact that all the watermarks are identical. So the artist, Bernardo, got a batch of paper and started work on a single batch of paper. Now, one might suppose that what an architect might do, or draftsman might do, is to take that paper, bind it into a book, and then do the drawings. But that seems not to be the case in this instance. And there's quite a bit of evidence to suggest that it was produced in a rather different way, and that the drawings were produced before the binding took place. Further suggesting that although it was conceived, produced on individual sheets, it was conceived right from the outset as a bound book. Now, what is that evidence? Well, there are two forms of evidence. One has to do with one of the drawing techniques used. Now, I'm going to ask you to try and imagine working on a bound sketchbook now and wanting to produce a drawing of a detail in very carefully worked out perspective. Now, you have a book resting on your desk, which maybe is an inch thick, and then you have to get a long rule to produce the perspective, which is then wobbling around on top of your book, and you're trying to get the perspective right from a single focal point, which is miles off the side of the page, somewhere else on the table. That actually is a nightmare for a draftsman. And it suggests to me, well, it was one of the features of the drawing of the book that suggested to us that this wasn't how it was produced. Further evidence can be found in the double page spreads or double folios that appear at the center of each gathering. Here we see a plan of the Bars of Diocletian, which runs across a double page. And when you zoom in to the fold, the stitching fold, you can see that it's beautifully drawn even in the stitching fold. Now, you couldn't do that. I mean, you couldn't draw in a stitching fold if the book was already made up. I mean, just impossible. And you've even got two little lovely columns here that are right in that fold. Well, it would just be a blob of ink if you tried to draw in a stitching fold. So this was a sheet that was drawn first and bound later, and that applies to the whole of the codex or codices.
Well, you convinced me the drawings were definitely drawn first.
Yeah.
How was it then arranged originally?
Well, it was originally arranged according to drawing type. So right at the beginning of the book, we have a batch of plans, then we have elevations, and then we have details. So that, and finally, sort of random ornaments at the end. So you've got sort of four fundamental categories, but within those categories, there are also very neatly worked out subdivisions. So within the details, for example, you start off with Doric entablatures, and then you work down to smaller details within the Doric order and so forth. So it's very, very carefully planned. There are some anomalies here and there in the book, perhaps where, because it was all drawn on separate sheets, that he started the drawing on the wrong sheet. So the arrangement is quite carefully, I mean, by the standards of the day, compared with a sketchbook like the Barberini sketchbook, where you have a scattering of drawings from different monuments randomly placed and often quite beautifully placed on the page. But this is much more rigorous in terms of its general conception.
And was that original conception, rigorous and careful original conception, was that exceptional at the time?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely it was. Because what our researchers very excitingly uncovered, when we think, for example, about the date of the drawings, which must be 1513, 1540, that's in the lifetime of Bramante. Perhaps I should add that we know this because a number of drawings are associated with particular dates, and these dates are always 1513 and 1514, and that will be within the lifetime of Bramante. But what this shows is that the drawings are connected with a very detailed record that is amassed at this time in the Codex Coner of the, by then, accrued knowledge of Rome's ancient architecture. So it's as if the idea was to document what was known as well as possible about ancient buildings at this particular moment. So historically, therefore, the Codex Coner is very important, and it demonstrates that there was an enormous campaign of finding out about buildings that took place in the years immediately before 1514. So this is one reason that the compilation is so exceptional. And the other one is that the drawings are remarkably accurate and objectively accurate, so that they don't rely very much, if at all, on speculative reconstructions of buildings. They're dependent instead on recently acquired data. So they are, in that sense, very careful documentations of ancient buildings as they were seen to exist at this particular moment in time. Then beyond that, we can talk about a consistency of representation, so that the same kinds of representative techniques are applied to buildings and to details of all kinds. And this consistency of approach is very unusual for the moment, and it is different from compilations that were produced beforehand. And then beyond that, if we look at the next slide, we can see that there are actually, among the drawings, various novel approaches being taken towards architectural representation. So in these two examples on the left, I'm showing you one drawing of one of the triumphal arches, which is the Arch of Titus. And what the drawing shows are the parts of the building which existed at that time. It's a selection of them. So the drawing selects those parts of the existing structure which were indeed ancient, and it kind of discounts and discards all the rest. If we look at the drawing on the right, what is really interesting about drawings such as this is just how much information about a building is conveyed so economically in a drawing which is partly elevational, partly sectional, and kinds of focuses on different parts of the building in order to create a very good idea of the building as a whole. And finally, we could just sort of add, I think, that the Codex Coner differs from other books of drawings for the reason we've mentioned already, that it was a commission, apparently, which was produced, and the drawings were produced over a very short span of time. And just to reiterate again, this is very different from the way in which compilations were put together beforehand, where sketchbooks could include drawings that were accumulated over very many years. And then we can move on from here and just to sort of look at
for those who
some of the remarkable approaches that we see.
Some of the buildings that are in the volume.
Okay, so the next slide.
Do you want me to have it?
Yeah, I think so.
About this, David?
Yeah.
Well, here are the drawings of the Colosseum. We have 4 plans and 3 elevations. And the plans that we have here are the most comprehensive group of drawings of the Colosseum and its planning produced in this period, at a level of detail that really finds nothing comparable until the 17th century, until Day's work in the 17th century. What's remarkable about them is their degree of accuracy, not just of detail, but of geometry. Indeed, the drawing that we see here is geometrically accurate. It compares really quite favourably with modern surveys of the Colosseum. Other really celebrated architects of the day, if you think of Palladio, if you think of Serlio, when they draw the Colosseum, they get the geometry completely wrong. The Codex Coner gets it completely right. I mean, it's really a terrific piece of work.
I think you'll see that in the next slide, Paul.
Yeah, so you can see
that's a 19th century drawing.
Yes, you can see that the shape of the central arena here and the concentric ovals is really very, very comparable to this. In the earlier other drawings by Serlio and Palladio, the shape of the oval tends to be much wider in relation to its length. One of the interesting things about this survey is that it would have required a considerable amount of work in terms of manpower to produce it. You'd have needed a huge team of people with ropes and chains and scaffolding and goodness knows what to create such fantastically accurate surveys. We know a little bit about this survey, in fact, that it was a survey of 1513, July 1513, because that's noted in a sketchbook by Giuliano da San Gallo. One of the things that is also interesting about this particular representation of the plan of the Colosseum is something that David was talking about earlier, the way in which what is represented is only what was visible, ignoring any conjectural reconstruction of the building. So, for example, is my cursor visible, by the way, on the screen? Yes. Yeah, yes, okay. So the inner arena here is not drawn. All that is drawn...
No, it's not moving your cursor, I'm afraid.
Oh, it's not. Oh, never mind. But you can see just at the long sides, if you can have a long side of an oval, but I suppose you can, the long sides of an oval, 4 little piers that project out into the space. Those are elements of the perimeter of the arena. The rest hasn't been drawn because that was just a pile of rubble. So he's been very careful to differentiate between what he can see and what he can't see. Okay, David, would you like to say something about the Bars of Caracalla?
Yes, keep this slide on, but just to make it absolutely clear what you were saying, that is, the Colosseum drawings are a record of an actual survey in which information about the Colosseum was established for the first time. So the Codex Coner shows us what was discovered at this vital moment in the story of the understanding of Rome's ancient monuments. And you see this approach time and time again. So on the slide now is a paired sheet showing the plan of the Baths of Caracalla. And this is remarkable because it is the earliest representation that survives, which shows the Baths of Caracalla with a reasonable, in fact, an impressive degree of accuracy. So again, the drawing in the Codex Coner is a record of a laborious survey of this ruinous ancient monument that must have taken place really quite recently. And you can judge the accuracy of the Coner drawing simply by comparing it with later modern representations of the same complex. So I'm showing you a late 19th, early 20th century plan of the Baths of Caracalla. And while you might say there are certain slight errors in the Codex Coner drawing, there is nevertheless a remarkable and astonishing degree of correspondence between the two. And therefore, this drawing, as a surviving record of what was discovered early on in the 16th century, shows how understandings of the Bars of Caracalla from this moment onwards began to, little by little, increase. If you look hard at the Codex Coner drawing, you'll see just occasionally there are sort of gaps of record taking. So, for example, the colonnades of internal courtyards and so on. Well, that's because they don't exist, or they couldn't be established because of the ruinous nature of the site. So it's these sort of gaps that were gradually filled in as the 16th century then progressed. Let's see what the next slide is.
We've got the Pantheon now. And the Pantheon sort of reinforces some of the stories that we've been telling you about so far. The facade of the Pantheon here on the left shows you the Pantheon not quite as it would appear in the 16th century, because in the early 16th century the Pantheon was set below ground level, and between some of the columns there were walls inserted with doors in them. So what Bernardo has done in representing the Pantheon in terms of its elevation is to remove later accretions, but not to reconstruct anything new, not to add anything. So he takes things away quite happily, but doesn't add anything. And he actually represents the building with the ground level reduced to its original ground level. So he's not changing the building, he's changing the environment around the building, not the building itself. His drawings of the interior are also very intriguing. And he attempts to represent the building in ways that are both accurate and provide information which strangely at times introduces inaccuracies. So I'd like to talk a little bit about the drawing that we see on the left-hand side of the screen. This ostensibly is a section through the Pantheon, but it isn't a completely accurate representation, and intentionally so. A longitudinal section through the Pantheon would show you a large apse here on the right-hand side of the drawing, and the entrance to the Pantheon on the left-hand side of the drawing. But that's not what is represented. What he's interested in here is showing you the form of the exedrae behind the columnar screens in the Pantheon. So what we have at the right-hand side of the drawing is one of the semicircular exedrae, and on the left-hand side is a rectangular exedra. So you've got a drawing which represents one of the features of the Pantheon, and their different forms. You could never see that this would never work as an accurate, or doesn't work as an accurate representation of the building, but it does work as a diagram of the various forms that one gets in the Pantheon. So it's a very complex concept as a drawing. a drawing that's a misrepresentation in order to give you accurate information about the building.
It's fascinating how innovative these drawings must have been at the time. In what way did the Codex Coner have a historical impact?
That becomes clear, I think, Francis, when we begin to think about what it is we're looking at when we see the Codex Coner. And once we realize that the Codex Coner is a record of almost scientific study of ancient buildings that was conducted in the early part of the 16th century, once we realize that, we'll also realize that it is a unique record, and we wouldn't really know what it was that people knew about ancient buildings were it not for the survival of the Codex Coner. So you could talk about impact in two ways. So you could say, for example, that it did have impact, such as in the fact it was copied very soon after it was produced by Michelangelo. But in addition to that, we can also talk about the indirect impact of it as a compilation of study about ancient Rome made in the early part of the 16th century. Because once we think about the Codex Coner in that way, we're then able to see how knowledge of ancient Rome in the early 16th century was then built upon in drawings made later on. So although people weren't exactly responding to the Codex Coner in the later part of the 16th century because it was tucked away and hidden somewhere, what it represents, that is the knowledge of ancient Rome in the early 16th century, would have and can be shown to have an extraordinary influence in that it laid the foundations for studies and explorations of ancient Rome conducted by later figures, such as Antonio da San Gallo, such as, in particular, Palladio, who is one of those mid-century architects, antiquarians, who is building on the tradition of knowledge that you can see established in the Codex Coner. So from that perspective, we can say very confidently that the Codex Coner represents the birth of modern archaeology better than any other artifact to survive from this very important period. It represents the birth of modern archaeology, and it also represents a reconsideration of the power and effectiveness of architectural draftsmanship. So from both perspectives and others, it is a uniquely important document.
I would say that all this research that you both have done on the volume is uniquely important. I think we're going to know an awful lot more about it as a result, and the Soane Museum is extraordinarily grateful to you both. So for the benefit of those watching us, can you just explain what's going to become of your fabulous research?
Well, maybe two things. I mean, we have a contractual obligation with the Soane Museum, which we were delighted to secure, which will result in us producing a new catalogue of the Codex Coner, and this catalogue will be hosted on the Soane Museum website. So all the information that we find about it will be available to everybody to see and think about. So that's going to be one outcome. There are other plans afoot too. So we are at least thinking about the possibility of having an exhibition about the Codex Coner, which will involve displaying later drawings of ancient monuments that depend upon the knowledge accrued in the Codex Coner itself. So there's a sort of two possibilities for the immediate future, which we're very grateful to be able to be involved with.
And we are very grateful to you both for all your hard work. Before we wrap up, is there anything further that either of you would like to add? Or have you you've given us quite a lot.
I've spent a lot of my academic life, Francis, thinking I would love to see the Codex Coner. And I actually saw it not so very long ago in connection with this project. And I think Paul and I would both like to say what a privilege and an honor it is to be able to work on this artifact, not least because it turns out to be such a very, very important artifact.
Yeah, I know.
And far, far more interesting to work on than ever we imagined. And we realised it was going to be a fantastic project, but it's actually turned out to be even more fantastic than we imagined.
Well, I'm so pleased, and let me reiterate again how grateful we are that you're doing the project. No two people could be better placed to undertake this research, and we're so very much looking forward to your catalogue being published on the website alongside our others. So it just remains for me to say to those who are watching us, I have been Francis Sands, the Curator of Drawings and Books at the Soane Museum, and we have been listening to David Hemsoll and Paul Davies. Thank you very much to you both, and I do hope that everybody will come back and watch another Soane Museum Study Group session in the future. Thank you.